It's long past time. We got back out there. So where to? Dulles International Airport. Let your imagination soar. Book now at flydulles.com/nonstop.
This is Ralph Rindler, director of the Smithsonian Bicentennial Folklife Festival. If you enjoyed the festival, you'll be interested in this invitation.
Ladies and gentlemen, an opportunity like this cannot be taken for granted.
This evening, we are going to be beating our hearts out for you all, so I want to see people enjoying themselves. So get up and feel the music and do something about it, okay?
This event is a right of cultural democracy.
We have many, many partners, you included. I encourage you to stand alongside with us as we travel this journey year after year.
Good afternoon. My name is Haley Francis. I work at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, and I am the Major Gift Officer leading our fundraising operations and strategic partnerships. I would like to welcome you to the 2023 Smithsonian Folklife Festival. For over 50 years, the festival has convened people on the National Mall to explore, exchange, and engage the power of culture and creativity in our lives. This year, our two programs are the Ozarks, Faces and Facets of a Region, and Creative Encounters, Living Religions in the U.S. Add your festival stories to ours on social media using the hashtag 2023Folklife. The Smithsonian Folklife Festival is produced by the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage and presented in partnership with the National Park Service. The festival is made possible for you all and the general public by you all, with your generous support. And for the Creative Encounters programming, we've received generous support from the Lilly Foundation, or the Lilly Endowment's Religion and Cultural Institutions Initiative, a national initiative that aims to help museums and other cultural institutions foster greater public understanding about religion and present the contributions of people of all faiths and diverse religious communities. The program also received federal support from the Latino Initiative Pool and the National Museum of the American Latino and the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. So a little bit of housekeeping. The festival hours are from 11 to 5:30, and most of the special events take place at 6 p.m. And the most up-to-date festival schedule with performances, etc., is available on our website, which is festival.si.edu. We have a recycling and composting program, so please place your items where you would like, as long as it's in the proper receptacles, and visit the marketplace online. Don't forget our delicious festival bites at our concession stands as well. So, today is a very special day. We have 3 inspirational men who we will be in discussion with about a film called Finding Fellowship. So before we dive in, I would like to introduce our panelists. Here with us today, we have Jason Green, the film's producer, Reverend Dr. Gerard Green, Jr., chair of the Pleasant View Board of Trustees and Jason's father, and Joshua Dubois, CEO of Values Partnerships. Before we dive into the discussion, we're going to play a small clip from the film, about 10 minutes, and then after that, we'll dive into a really exciting conversation with some of the most inspirational people who I've ever met.
Given how hard it was to integrate our schools, I can almost understand why we stopped there.
I define desegregation and integration differently. We use the terms interchangeably, but I think there's an important distinction in that desegregation is really just the mixing of bodies, but integration is based on perfect social equality. It's part of Dr. King's beloved community. And when he talked about integration and desegregation, he mentioned that desegregation was physical proximity without spiritual affinity. And so I definitely think it translates into our faith community.
Dr. King's beloved community was a vision of how we could function together as a society, where even if we disagreed, we were still uniting with one another on the basis of our shared humanity and a shared love for our fellow man, no matter their race, their class, their gender, their sexual orientation, where we were connected heart to heart, soul to soul, first and foremost, and made what we had in common more important than what divided us.
The culture in which I had grown up those first 4 or 5 years had changed. We kids, black kids and white kids, were interacting with one another in schools. We were going to dances together, and we were in the midst or on the cusp of a civil rights and changes taking place within society. And yet, the reality was that the place that was segregated was the church.
I think it is one of the tragedies of our nation, one of the shameful tragedies, at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours, if not the most segregated hours in Christian America.
Dr. King, as we know, was a visionary, and unfortunately, I think that remains one of our challenges even today. I would say in our denomination, probably 85% of our churches remain segregated. It's not intentional, but they remain either all white or black or Hispanic or Korean. The reason why you don't have many churches merging in our denomination is that we have a lot of family churches because their families started this church. This is my uncle's pew, my mother's pew. They don't want to give it up.
In 1968, Quince Orchard was a microcosm of America, represented by the breadth of these 3 Methodist churches, 1 black, 2 white, 1 northern, 1 southern. As each struggled with its bleak financial future, segregation threatened the future of all 3 small Methodist churches.
In 1968, we were thinking that we could not make it by ourselves in our church because the membership was dwindling. And so at the time, we only had a part-time minister.
Actually, we had taken an inventory of the potential growth of Pleasantville. That wasn't very promising.
My brother Melvin was one of the ones that was instrumental in saying, you have got to realize that you cannot carry this church on by yourself.
Honey, you had dinners regularly on a regular basis every year. Didn't have enough people to build their furniture right. McDonald Chapel was the same situation. We didn't really have enough people to put on dinner.
We had so many dinners. We had a dinner, I think, every week. That's how we raised our money. But the same people came to the dinner. The same people brought the dinners. The same people furnished the food for the dinner.
McDonald Chapel and Hunter Hill was almost walking distance from us. So why should we have 3 little churches striving to get along when we could all come together in one church and have the minister?
Well, I was initially pastor of just McDonald's Chapel and Hunting Hill. Their pastor at Pleasant View came from clear on the other side of Gaithersburg. He and I were talking, and I said, well, maybe I should become pastor of Pleasant View. We didn't go do it, and so I began to explore that possibility. And I became pastor of all 3 churches.
Oh my goodness. First time I ever heard a man's cussing in church. When Hunt Hill and Quince Orchard, McDonald Chapel was discussing the merger, some of them wanted it and some of them didn't.
It wasn't like I didn't have any interaction with white people back then. It's just that we just never went to school together or church together.
I had feelings about it. I didn't want to lose. This was mine. This is home. This is all I'd known since a kid. It's like, I don't want to go anywhere else and be somebody else's whatever. I want to stay here. and let this be my church until death do I part.
People's identities are really wrapped up in a lot of ways in a church. And the question then emerges, will I have that space anymore? Not just the physical space where I'm sitting on, but the space in this ecosystem that is the church. And that feels threatening to some people.
My dad's grandfather had been one of the folks who put up the funds to purchase this land. So he was very vested in this church and in this property. The question that was part of his mind was, so if we do this, what happens if it doesn't work?
On the evening of April 4th, 1968, the members of Pleasant View gathered for a dinner to discuss their uncertain future.
Do they stay as a small church and potentially cease to exist? Or do they merge with two other white churches and lose some of the independence and autonomy that they've had as this small church? We thought it would be interesting to bring some of those members back together to discuss and reflect on what that night was like for them.
We give you thanks for the meaning and the purpose of this gathering as we reflect on the saying that happened so many years ago.
Each church could not afford a minister. We had to be with another church. And the congregation was just dwindling. Children were growing up and they had jobs and they moved close to where they worked. So neither of the churches had enough of a congregation to continue keeping the church.
Discussions were taking place about whether or not there was actually going to be a transfer of membership from Pleasant View. I remember that having gone to schools where integration had taken place, was kind of in favor of that transition taking place. And yet, that put me at odds with my dad.
The room was tense, as you can imagine, really separating families. I know my father and his father had a difference of opinion on whether or not the merger should take place or not.
That particular day, I remember we had eaten a meal here, and Melvin and Douglas Horton, who was the pastor of the congregation, they were in the car and they were listening to the radio. They came in and they told us that they heard on the news that Martin Luther King had been shot.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated on the radio.
We just forgot about the dinner. We just broke down praying, and I think that was the best thing that anyone could do.
In that moment, I remember all of us gathering around the flagpole and Reverend Horton having a word of prayer. And as he prayed, I didn't close my eyes. I wanted to watch him. I noticed there was a tear that was trickling down his cheek. Reverend Horton was white, and all others in that circle were black. And what moved me was there was this white man who was moved by the death of this black man. And it said to me that Dr. King's death was about more than just rights for black folk. He was about human rights. And that what Pleasant View was about was the moving in the direction that was a fulfillment of his dream.
At that point, the meeting dissolved. There was no vote taken at that point. They couldn't then bring themselves together to make such a big decision in the light of such a big event. But they did still come back together.
Yes, we had a vote. That was a secret vote. And I cannot tell you who voted for it, who voted against it. But it was a majority vote that wanted it to happen. All three congregations came together in one setting and cast the vote.
Did you want the merger to happen?
I worked for it. Young people was running the church. We would accept anybody that joined, regardless of the race, color, or creed.
On a Sunday morning in September, I think it was the fourth Sunday in September of 1968. I remember very clearly. We went up to join the church, and we sat in their services. We enjoyed their services when the doors opened for us to come to join the church. We walked up to join.
And one Sunday, in about the second or third row from the back was about 10 black ladies and men. And the minister said, "We got ministers today." And one of them stood up and said, "We'd like to join you."
Those three churches, two white and black, decided to reconcile, to come together, and to forge a new future. Create something different, not just for themselves, but for their children, the generations to follow.
We certainly needed examples of African Americans and white Americans living together, working together, worshiping together. I didn't have any question about when it should happen.
It's so hard for me to believe that while riots erupted and cities burned, these three small churches decided to merge. And yet the hardest decision wasn't to come together, it was the decision to stay together. When Hunting Hill, McDonald Chapel, and Pleasant View all came together, they decided to build a new building and take on a new name, Fairhaven. You see, when the Apostle Paul was traveling to Rome, he and his crew encountered rough seas. They took refuge at the port of Fairhaven. So Fairhaven's an appropriate name because it wasn't all smooth sailing.
So, thank you for that. So here we are on the National Mall, having a conversation about faith, community, and this film highlights how in Quince Orchard, Maryland, three churches merged together, and how Martin Luther King's assassination kind of played a role in sparking this idea that it was necessary to happen at that particular time. Joshua, can you provide some context for what Martin Luther King spoke about when what he meant when he spoke about beloved community, and what the Black church has meant to the Black community throughout the generations?
Absolutely, Haley. And first, thank you so much for having me and having us. And huge thanks and congratulations to Jason and Reverend Dr. Green and the Green family, which has blessed the country and blessed our communities with this film. I commend it to everyone here and watching online, because it does tell the story both about a particular set of churches, but also the central story of the church in American life that your question references. Haley, for so many folks, and especially and in particular in the Black community, the church has been at the heart of who we are, quite frankly. Think about my great-grandmother, Ola Mae Webb. She passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 96. And her vocation throughout much of her life was cleaning houses for white Americans who lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and both cleaning houses, changing bedpans, doing a lot of work that, while hugely important, and she created dignity out of it, was a draw on her dignity. It took a lot out of her to do that work. But when she came to Payne Chapel AME Church on Sunday, she was the chair of the usher board. She was the person who did the announcements every Sunday in church. She had a zone, a space in her life where she could determine what happened, and where she could be in community, and where she was reminded of her humanity in case the world made her at times forget that. And so, and that is the case for millions and millions of people, both today and over the course of our history. It has been sort of a backbone. That doesn't mean it's perfect. Lots of challenges, lots of complexities. We saw some of the challenges come out even in this film as people are working through relationships and working through the difficulties of and complexities of human relationships. But it is, it's central, quite simply, Haley. It's a central force in American life.
Absolutely. And Reverend Green, The three churches that were in conversation are the Donald Chapel, Pleasant View, and Hunting Hill. Can you give us background on the three denominations? Because they were separate, but ultimately came together, but what was it that made them distinctly separate?
Surely. Thank you, first of all, Haley, for providing this opportunity for us to come and have conversation about the Quince Orchard community, what took place, and the history of that particular community. When you speak in terms of McDonald Chapel and Hunting Hill and Pleasant View, we have to go back to a time in American history when the issue of slavery was in the forefront. And within the Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, there was an issue about whether or not pastors could own slaves. And there was a schism that took place within the Methodist Church over the issue of slavery. And so the church split into the Methodist Church North, those who were in opposition to clergy and the idea of persons owning slaves, and the Southern Church. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just the North and the South. There was the issue in terms of what do we do with those black persons. And so we have McDonald Chapel representing the Southern Methodist Episcopal Church. Hunting Hill was the Northern Church, and Pleasant View was a black congregation.
And so all of these were based in Quince Orchard, right?
All three churches were in Quince Orchard within, I would say, a radius of 1.5 miles of one another. So in order to go to Pleasant View, I needed to walk past McDonald Chapel. As I was making my journey into Rockville, where school was, I needed to go past Hunting Hill. So they were all within close proximity to one another, yes.
So what was it that made Quince Orchard such a special community? You grew up there, right? Or your family grew up there?
Yes, my family grew up there. Quince Orchard for me is home. It's a place where I grew up in the 50s, but it was a place where segregation existed, but in some ways I was protected against the segregation. I grew up in a black community, and the church was the center of that community. And yet at the same time, there was interaction that was taking place with white folk who were part of the community, but there wasn't this sense in my mind in terms of a separation, except within the church, and I guess you could say within the school system. There was interaction that was taking place at a level, and let me explain what I mean. My father had skills as a carpenter. There was a man who was at the end of the road who had skills in terms of being a mechanic. Although things were segregated, there was opportunity for my father to use his skills as a mechanic, as a carpenter in working with that white person, and there were skills that white person had in terms of being able to work on my dad's car. So there was interaction that was taking place. But when we moved beyond that to interact in church or in school, things were segregated. And so what made Quince Orchard special for me was that it was a place in which I was nurtured. It was a place in which my ancestors were willing to invest in land. My ancestors were actually enslaved in the Quince Orchard community. And after slavery, they did not choose to go to a different location. They chose to invest themselves within the community of Quince Orchard. And as a result of that, I'm here.
Yeah, absolutely. My next question is for you, Jason, because you are standing in this incredible legacy of faith and community that you really wanted to illuminate through this film. What is it that inspired you to make the film?
Haley, first, thank you for bringing us together and appreciate your vision. Joshua, brother, just so grateful that you've been on this journey with us, and thank you for joining us today. And Dad, I sit in awe of you every day, and that's part of the inspiration. But maybe I can just take us all back in time just a little bit to 2013 when we began this journey. And Joshua and I worked together in the White House for President Obama. I was a lawyer in that capacity, and I got a phone call one day that my then 95-year-old grandmother had gone into the hospital. And to give you some context, As Dad articulated, we're from Quince Orchard. I grew up on the same street as my grandparents. They lived at the top of the hill. My parents lived at the bottom of the hill. And in early elementary years, I would get dropped off at my grandparents' house after school. And my grandmother volunteered at the local hospital. So 5-year-old and 6-year-old Jason on Tuesdays and Thursdays would walk into Asbury with my grandmother. And hearing you talk about dignity, Joshua, reminds me of my grandmother in those days would walk into dark rooms where people were ailing and offer them gifts of dignity late in life. A steady hand, a daily devotional, an ice chip, and I got to watch service in action. Okay? So fast forward, I get the phone call that my 95-year-old grandmother has, of all things, gone into that very same hospital, where I got to be introduced to service and these ideas of dignity late in life, and I thought, of course I'm supposed to go and hold her hand and offer her a daily devotional in the same way that I saw her give so many others. And so I think that we should recognize that in our lives there are sometimes forcing events that we have to be responsive to. And in many respects, I have been too busy and self-consumed and on an individual path and pursuit that hadn't allowed me to hear all of these stories before. And this was my wake-up call. And so I got to go and sit at the bedside of my then 95-year-old grandmother, now 105, praise the Lord. But I got to hear all of the stories. And one of the stories that she told me was about how her African-American church that my great-great-grandfather had founded shortly after the end of slavery, how that church and how its rich history and its legacy, deserving of a movie in and of itself, but how a few generations later, in 1968, right, the church that was founded in 1868, now in 1968, had fallen on hard times and had decided to merge its congregation with 2 white congregations. Now, as I'm sitting on the edge of the bedside hearing this story, I'm in disbelief. Given where we are as a country in 2013, how divided economically, politically, socially, racially. I remember the day that I heard that story, I had listened on the radio and I had heard Kojo Nandi on NPR say that we are divided irreconcilably, and we haven't been this divided since 1968. And then I sat at my grandmother's bedside and heard a story from when? From 1968 that talked about the descendants of the former enslaved, that talked about the descendants of former owners of the enslaved, deciding to not be bound by their past and choosing a new and different future. What moved me, Haley, to your question about what inspired me, was the fact that these were everyday people. These were the mechanics and the carpenters and the farmers of Quince Orchard who decided to not wait for government, to not wait for the problem solvers to come, but to themselves decide how they were going to change and shape and stay alive. I think to frame this conversation so beautifully, we're talking about living religions.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
this decision to merge was a decision about survival. It was a decision about preserving a legacy long enough that I would be able to be inspired by it. And so to be there, to hear the story, and then share it with all of these beautiful people.
Absolutely. That's so wonderful. And each of you, in your own ways, has your thumb on the pulse of community and faith and hope. And I'm curious from each of you, starting with Joshua, especially since you work in such a national context with different faith communities around the nation, different churches, etc. From what you're able to surmise based on your interactions with so many people, do you see that there is hope for togetherness, even in the midst of all of this division?
It's a great question, Haley, and I do believe that there's hope. And it's interesting. I think the hope that we saw around those tables where folks were meeting on April 4th, 1968, that was horribly interrupted by the news on the radio. You'll see all this in the movie, but then the decision to come together. I feel like that hope was actually planted years before, and I'm going to get to your question in a minute. There's another scene in the movie that was resonant for me, and it was the fact that they were talking about some families where after school, even in the midst of segregation, segregated churches, segregated schools, a couple of the white kids who lived on the same street would come over and play with the black family and would be fed, and mom would feed the white kids dinner, and they're just kids being kids, right? And I think that that's where the hope is. I have been sort of navigating complexities related to race and racial justice in this country in different roles professionally for a long time, and some of that is intractable and tough, and we saw even further toughness in the last few weeks, Supreme Court and so forth. But then I go to my kid's school and I see August, my 7-year-old, playing with his best friend Joseph, and I'm not implying that everything is always going to be hunky-dory, but they are not carrying the same baggage. They are able to connect human to human around soccer or Pokemon or the tough things of the day or whatever the case may be. And I believe that's where the seeds are planted. And I think probably the decision, because that was a radical decision in 1968.
Absolutely.
For Pleasant View, and I'm always mixing up the names of the churches, but for Hunter Hill, and especially that Southern Methodist one, right? I mean, I don't know if there were too many precedents, but in my understanding of the church at that time, it's fairly unprecedented. So there had to be something in them, some set of relationships, some memories of connection that maybe were planted as children that they had to tap into.
Right.
And that's what brought people back together. And so that's the hope for me, is the hope in the next generation. And I think there's a fair amount of hope there.
That's beautiful. What about you, Jason?
Yes, and just to pick up on that thread, I'm sure Dad will talk about some of his childhood experiences and how those seeds got planted, but I think Josh was absolutely right. And I would go to this idea of hope in action.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things that moved me so much about this story wasn't that in 1968, on April 4th, after the assassination of Dr. King, that these three churches joined hands, and sang hallelujah and walked into the sunset. Part of what gave me hope was that as soon as these three churches merged, trouble arose. Mm-hmm. So members left each of the three congregations. Sometimes people would walk into the service, even of those who voted for an integration, and all of the white congregants would be sitting on the left and all the black congregants would be sitting on the right. They had to navigate what a service would look like. Who would preach and for how long? What hymnal would you use? Or what tone would you sing in? All of those things had to be navigated. And there were steps forward and steps back. And what I see is this congregation that continues to rise to the challenge, not perfectly, but they recognize that there is a higher principle that they are ascribing to, that they want to see manifest and working towards it. And what I found beautiful, just as an example, is when there was a group of people dedicated to the idea of going and sitting in between. When they would walk into the sanctuary on those mornings when it happened to be segregated, they would physically use their bodies to go and sit in between. And so when we talk about hope, part of the problem is that there's confusion, there's uncertainty. People wonder, what can I do? Part of when to your question about inspiration, what inspired me, I was inspired to tell this story because people felt that division was something that was happening to them. They didn't feel like they had agency. They were apathetic to what they could do to actually push back against it. And so when we look at this is a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. There's power in the mundane of just going and sitting in between. I find hope in that.
That's beautiful. Reverend Green?
Yes, I ditto to what Joshua said, ditto to what Jason said. I would also offer the word that trouble don't last always. I think what both are speaking about is the willingness on the part of black folk and white folk to get proximate with each other. that in order for there to be change, that we can't stay in our comfortable camps, that we need to be willing to engage with one another beyond the surface. And so when those folk decided that they were going to merge, it meant that they were in proximity to one another, and there needed to be some intentional acts on the part of some of those folk to say, well, it's not enough for us just to be in the building with one another. We need to get to know one another on a different level. Now, also understand what was taking place within the school system. Their kids were already interacting with one another. They had begun to build a relationship with one another. And so, in some ways, the kids were leading the way. The church is supposed to be a transforming force within the community, and yet sometimes the church is a little behind the times, and it needs a boost from some other avenue. Within my faith tradition, I think in terms of the person who gave his life upon a cross, that person got proximate with the people. That person did not stay within the synagogue, went out along the margins of society and was always pushing the margins to say, these people should be included. These are people who should be part of the beloved community. And I believe that at times the church has forgotten who it is and what it's about in terms of pushing those margins and being an inclusive community. But within the merger of those three congregations, those folk decided that we need to make this work, because if we don't, we won't survive. And I think we're not in a survival mode across the country in terms of our churches. And yet, some are. Some are. Yeah.
So, in thinking about this story, it's like it was destined to happen. This merger, the seeds that had been planted throughout the generations along the way. And even though, and this is actually in reference to a clip in the documentary that wasn't in this particular short clip that we watched, but I'm thinking about the moment when your family had been doing some archival research and, digging up your past and your family tree, and there was a discovery that it was heartbreaking. Can you talk to us about the moment when you made this discovery about your family tree that provided even more context to why this merger was so important?
Surely. So the portion that you're speaking of is, I still get emotional about it. Gary Green is my great-great-grandfather. And so the story about my great-great-grandfather was that he was a carpenter and who went about building homes within the Quince Orchard community. But there wasn't a great deal that was known about him. One day, we had gathered at my home, and Jason brought in a friend who had done some research related to our family. What was presented was a census report, and the census report listed the name of Gary Green. Gary Green was a slave. That was the first knowledge that I had of Gary Green being enslaved. Next to that was the fact that he was enslaved for life. That meant for me that I needed to flip the script, you might say. That this was now not a person who was free to go about whatever it is that he wanted to do. This was a person who was owned by someone for life. And in order for him to move about, he
and we diminish their stories if we don't underscore how relevant their lives and their history still is to this day. Sorry to jump in there.
No,
Absolutely.
just to go on that point, and I'll come back to your question, Haley. But Dad mentioned Matilda Green.
Yes.
With Green's wife. She died in 1918, the year that my grandmother was born. Right? My grandfather had a relationship with her, with his grandfather and grandmother, and so to Joshua's point, that is incredibly proximate.
So this is the woman with whom, this is your grandfather's grandfather's wife. Is that right?
My grandfather's yes.
So I'm just curious. Did Grandma Pearl, was she born before or after she died?
She had just missed her.
But
my grandfather, my grandmother's husband, had a relationship with her.
Wow.
He was born in 1909, and so he knew his grandmother, who had lived in slavery, was born into slavery.
I mean,
had a
direct
relationship
connection, Jason. I mean, direct connection.
Exactly. And so part of, to your point, Haley, about these testaments and memorials and why we build these legacies, for those in the audience who don't know, Dad talks about, just 3 years after the end of slavery, in 1868, Gary Green, my grandfather's grandfather, bought 3 acres of land, and on that land, they built a schoolhouse, a church building, and a cemetery. Truly this life cycle of the Black community, where you could educate your young and instill them with what Frederick Douglass called the emancipation, the uplifting of light that allows us all to be free. A church building where you can worship your God, as Joshua said, where when the rest of the world was telling you you weren't, this space provides you true sanctuary and to restore, to go back out into the world. And then the cemetery, where you can commune with your dead, right? This true life cycle space. And so that site is now 155 years old. And so Dad chairs the trustee board that oversees that site, and so we've committed ourselves. It is now a historic site.
Wow.
We are in the midst of, we've raised about $2 million to restore those physical spaces.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. We've got more to raise and more work to do. But to your point about hope, right? We remain hopeful about the future. And we think that these sites are not just a living legacy to our history. They are a testament. They stand as a memorial. But it's also an opportunity for us to do what Dad just said and get proximate with one another. To continue to host those cultural, religious, educational programming that allows us to move forward into a new and different future.
So as we wrap up this conversation, I want to thank you each for your contributions to the Smithsonian, to this beautiful event, the Creative Encounters Living Religions in the U.S., and for being an example of hope in action. I want to leave with an opportunity to let you all just let us know what's next on the horizon for you. I know that Reverend Green, you just retired, but what's next on the horizon for you?
So to become more engaged at the Pleasant View Historic Site, to make certain that that is rehabilitated, that there's opportunity for the community to be invited in to understand what it means to be in troubled times, but understanding that trouble don't last always, that to be at a place where you can actually touch and feel a situation in which people were able to look at their circumstances and say, no, we're not going to be defined by the past, we're going to create a new and bright future, and actually hear testimony of folk who were engaged in that.
Wonderful.
Beautiful.
What's next for you, Jason?
Supporting Dad in the Pleasant View Historic Site. The Finding Fellowship film is available to you. Please go to PBS in all its forms and fashions, download it, watch it, and I'll continue to carry the mantle. The film's theme and thesis is doers do, this idea of hope in action, where my grandmother schooled me as I sat at her bedside questioning, why would my great-great-grandfather build a school? Why would he buy land on the main drag, paint it white, and tell everybody that they were educating Black children there? I thought that that was unsafe. I thought that that was conspicuous. And my grandmother stopped me short and said, Jason, the Black children of the community needed a school. Your great-great-grandfather and those other men and women looked around their community, they saw a need, and they took action because they were doers, and doers do. And I want to continue to extol that message to this audience and those that are watching, that when there is a line to be on one side of, be on the side of looking around your community, seeing needs and taking action and being doers.
That's excellent. Joshua, what's next for you?
I mostly want to talk about what's next for these gentlemen. Something on the horizon for me. I run a company that, among other things, we do entertainment marketing, and our big upcoming project is preserving history by telling our story with the new film version of the Color Purple musical. So it's coming back to theaters the end of the year. We're very excited about it, and so we're building a whole campaign around that. But I want to end by honoring those people who 3 years after slavery, and you have to remember, we have to wrap our minds around what that means. How did they come up with the money to buy this land? That meant that, and a lot of times we use the word slave and we just think about sort of nameless, faceless individuals that were just toiling. And yes, they toiled, but they had lives and dreams. And a lot of times, particularly in the state of Maryland, folks, because they got just a little bit of a breather on Sunday, would go about doing something that helped them earn a little money, maybe selling vegetables on the side or something like that. I don't know how those folks earn that money. Maybe you all know a little bit more. But the fact is, 3 years after slavery, they bought land and they built something, and that is special. And so we honor them, and one way that we can honor them is to learn our history, not to run away from this history, but to run towards this history, understand our national stories by participating in events like this, connecting with the Smithsonian, but also in your own spaces, in your own families. Get deep in this history. It's a little messy sometimes, but it honors this journey that we've been on as a country. So I'm excited that this Green family is honoring their history, and I can't wait to hear where they go in the days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. A round of applause for Reverend Green, Jason Green, and Joshua Dubois. And also for our sound engineers and our stage manager who made all of this possible.
And to Haley Francis, can we give her a round of applause? Did a phenomenal job. Yes.
Thank you. And I do want to give a shout out to my colleague Marquette Foley, who is an incredible curator at the Smithsonian and unfortunately was not able to moderate today, so I'm standing in for her. But again, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.